The focus of Souls games combat has always been an emphasis on timing. Movement in Dark Souls is relatively high commitment, and so when you perform an attack, you won't be able to do anything else until the attack completes and the animation plays out. And so pretty much in all Souls games, combat is about finding openings. It's about finding an opportunity to attack. It's about finding an opportunity to heal. You dodge, block, and position yourself so that you can take advantage of that opportunity, and when finally the moment comes, you attack as much as you can. This rhythm is the heart of Souls combat. It's one of the very main reasons that Souls games became popular in the first place. And it's pretty much maintained itself unchanged since the days of Demon Souls. And Elden Ring is no different. Elden Ring has that same heart of Dark Souls. It's about finding and taking advantage of opportunities. But it's also doing something different. It's doing something interesting, and that's what I want to talk about today in this video. You see, in the previous games, when I say taking advantage of an opening, I mean something very specific. Exploiting an opportunity in those games is synonymous with pushing the R1 button. At least it is when we're talking about boss battles. There are caveats, of course. Some weapons had R2 attacks that were very useful against some enemies, and some of them were very useful in PvP. And in Dark Souls 3 you had weapon arts, and some of those weapon arts were useful in the previous situations, and some of them were even useful in boss battles, sometimes. But even with those caveats, I think my point stands. Generally, during a boss battle, when you find an opening, you're doing standard R1 attacks. Generally. And there's usually a good reason for that. They don't do that much more damage than a normal R1. And for R2s to reach maximum damage, they would need to be charged, which would have you staying in place for much longer than is wise during a boss battle. So they're just impractical. They're riskier to do, they don't do enough damage to compensate the risk that you put yourself in, and generally, spamming R1 will end up doing more DPS anyway. But now it looks like Elden Ring is trying to change that. Elden Ring has added mechanics that I think are designed to incentivize the player to play slightly different when it comes to melee combat against bosses, and I guess some regular enemies as well. I'm talking about the stagger meter. In Elden Ring there's an invisible posture bar that all enemies have. When you deplete that bar, the enemies are opened up for a critical strike that's similar to a riposte after a parry. It's similar to the posture bar that enemies had in Sekiro. Or maybe a more comparable example is the posture bar that enemies have in Ghost of Tsushima. And the interesting thing about this posture bar is that you're very unlikely to break it with just R1 attacks. And that's true even if you're using a big weapon like a claymore and two-handing it. R1s by default seem to have a very low posture breaking ability, regardless of what weapon you're using. On the other hand, fully charged R2s do massive damage to the posture bar. And in fact, they've been buffed quite a bit because they do like 3 times the damage of a normal swing. I tried it with several weapons, and pretty much all the ones that I checked, the fully charged R2 did about 3 times as much damage as a normal R1 for that same weapon. It was crazy. Jumping R2s also do decent damage, and they do big damage to the stagger bar. And it works similarly for the other new mechanic, the guard counter that you can do. It also does a lot of damage to enemy posture. Now all of this is told to the player in the opening tutorial when you played the network test, but I kind of overlooked it and didn't realize how important it was going to be until later down the line when I fought Margit the Fell Omen. Margit messed me up. He beat me so many times that I had to start experimenting with other stuff. And that's when I started experimenting with jump attacks, fully charged R2s, and shield counters. And what I noticed was that the times that I just used R1s, Margit would not get staggered even once. And that was even in fights where I had gotten his health so low that I almost killed him. But when I started weaving in these new mechanics, charged R2s, guard counters, and jumping R2s, it became rare from then on for me not to get 3 or 4 posture breaks and be able to critical strike him all those times. And I'm talking about with small weapons like longsword and scimitar. More importantly though, just look at this footage. Look at how cool you could look if you're playing with all these new mechanics. Having to make these new risk-reward decisions with these new mechanics feels amazing. And I'm fairly sure that it's intentional. I think the game is trying to guide you to play this way. I think that as you proceed down the game past the network test, more and more enemies and bosses are going to try and incentivize you to use the posture-breaking mechanics more and more. And not just in the game, I think the marketing material actually hints at how you're supposed to play as well. In the gameplay reveal, you had a guy using a greatsword. And even though he was using a greatsword and not a shield, he used the greatsword to block and used that block to guard counter, showcasing that it could be done, but I think also that it should be done, that you should take advantage of the guard counter even if you're using a two-handed weapon. And later down the line they showed off a very well-timed fully charged R2, which posture broke the dragon, and then he went in for a riposte. Or I guess it's not a riposte, a critical strike. So yes, I think the game is trying to lead us away from traditional R1 spams when it comes to battle. Hello, Future Redditosker here. While I was editing the video, after I had already recorded the audio, I had an idea of how I could test whether my theory was correct. I thought to myself, if Elden Ring wants you to block two-handed, at least more than they wanted you to in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, then it stands to reason that the amount of damage that swords reduce when you're two-handing them blocking would be greater than normal. Lore Hunter helped me find out what the guard values were for the regular longsword. Many thanks to him, by the way. And I compared them to the values that we had in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. And indeed I was right, the defense values for the longsword was much higher in Elden Ring, giving you a 65% damage reduction, which is 20% higher than what it was in Dark Souls 3, which was only 45%. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. In that Edge magazine interview for Miyazaki, they also talked to Vati, the biggest Dark Souls lore YouTuber. And Vati talked about this specific subject. This is what he had to say about it. You will find yourself deviating away from just R1s and realizing, oh my god, R2s are insane. I fought a boss with R1 and I didn't stagger it at all, but then I fought it weaving in some R2s and staggered it multiple times, and I could do multiple crits. Traditionally, it was never wise in Dark Souls to use R2s in combat. It was more of a niche button. After many hours with Elden Ring, I was happy to see that combat has deepened. There was also a Reddit post called You're Playing It Wrong, a comprehensive guide of how I think Elden Ring's combat works. And that post is basically making the same points. That Elden Ring is trying to guide us away from just spamming R1s, and that he thinks people haven't really noticed it yet because we're set in our ways from having played so many Souls games at this point. Let me just quote a little bit of what he says. Also, a lot of people have already noticed that the roll animation covers less distance and has less iframes than we are used to. This is because you're not supposed to roll through everything, and instead learn to mix your rolls with your blocks, which also allows you to use the block counters. This way the Sekiro elements really start to shine, since you have to be absolutely reactive in your blocks, and the combat starts to become something far greater than just big Dark Souls. It's beefier and more agile at the same time, a complex, dynamic, and brutal dance. This guy then goes on to explain how he thinks that Margit is supposed to be a kind of wall that forces you to engage with all of these different melee mechanics. I won't go into the specifics, you can read his post, I'll link it in the description. But seeing as how Margit was the way that I came to realize the utility of these mechanics, I think that he's probably right. I can't vouch for the validity of whether or not rolls have less iframes or cover less distance, I didn't test that. But regardless, I think this guy and Vati are right. The game is trying to lead us away from the traditional way that melee has so far been done in Dark Souls. Which is fantastic and gets me really excited. This is the biggest upgrade in depth that Souls melee combat has ever had. With the possible exception of Sekiro, but a lot of people don't consider Sekiro a Souls game. Regardless, I'm really excited to get back in there and experiment with it. Which is good because happily there's only about a month left before Elden Ring releases. I'm so excited. So excited. But anyway, that's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.